So the first thing I want to discuss is how we see life on Earth and what its correspondences to spiritual things. We're going to see functions that go on Earth are similar in form to functions that go on in the spiritual world. So we're going to explain the spiritual world and explain the Earth so you can see the connections between them. That's what I want to get to. So we begin with the first one, which is life on Earth and correspondences. And as I said, we want to, what I call the functional form of life on Earth and spiritual activities. Because we talked earlier about how God is the source of wisdom and love. And so I'm going to talk about wisdom and light. Wisdom comes from God and light comes from the sun. I'm going to show that there are similar processes involved. And so if you read the Bible, read spiritual things, the idea of a bright sun or a bright light always is used to refer to spiritual illumination or spiritual understanding. So the question is why is that? And then I'm going to see the similarities between plants and rational understanding. So it's a big question of seeing what plants do in the ecology of the world, and you can see how that's similar in functional form to the ecology of rational understanding. And we can think back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the first example in the Bible of, no, it's just not the first example. There, on the creation days, trees and green shoots and things were described. But as well as plants and rationality, we have the ecology of energy, which also comes from the sun, and love, which also comes from the divine source. Now, many people will say that energy is a kind of love, or love is a kind of energy, but what I want to show here, how energy and love are similar in each other. There's a functional form to do with energy, and there's a functional form to do with love, and they're similar so that they correspond to each other. And then we will look at the 5 senses, how humans have sight, hearing, taste, smelling, and touching. We'll see how they are related to the things that you need from a spiritual point of view. And then we'll look at the human body as a whole, just some general principles, the parts of the human body, what do they correspond to as a spiritual function. So I'm going to go through each of these. I have a slide for each of these topics here. And we'll in each of these slides, we're going to start either with going through the spiritual process and then give the physical process and see how they're similar, or we'll start from the physical process and discuss the spiritual process and see also how they're related. So we're going to compare wisdom with light from the sun. This is, as I said, a perpetual image, a metaphor, a simile to describe spiritual illumination. Now, this time we're going to start from the principles we had in the previous talks about God being the source of wisdom to see mental things. And that's what we think of as God as the source of wisdom. God is the source of wisdom. God is the source of love. But the question is how? How does that happen? What are the individual processes involved? And the first thing is that we don't actually see wisdom. We don't, but we see things in the light of wisdom. In other words, you can't, if you look at someone, or if wisdom is functioning in someone's life, you can't actually see it. But what it means is that they can see things and understand them in a wise way. So I was saying here is that we see things in the light of wisdom. And then, actually, we see things in the light of wisdom. So wisdom comes down, it shines on things, and then something is reflected into our own understanding, which is we see wisdom filtered by specific ideas, and these reflected into our understanding. And this is just like the sun shining on Earth. It shines on a rock or a tree outside, and then we look at it with our eyes. This is like sunlight from the sun, because we don't see sunlight, we only see things that reflect the sunlight. And we see clouds, we see the blue sky as the light being reflected or refracted by particles in the sky. And we see light coming from trees and rocks and houses and people, we don't actually see the light itself, but what we see is the things that the light reflects from. And this is the same as with wisdom. So actually we see sunlight filtered by specific objects and reflected into our eyes. So sunlight contains all colors, all mixed in together, and when it shines on a red object, all the colors except red are absorbed, and the light filtered by the properties of the object then come into our eyes, and we see the red light coming, and when the red light comes into our eyes, and with that we see the object that was red. So this is the same as wisdom. We don't see wisdom coming down, we just see things reflecting the light from wisdom. And so that means that it's impossible to tell that you're wise. It just means that everyone sees things, the truth of things, in their own way. And now if you were to see the truth of logic, or the truth of a religious idea, or the truth of some argument, or the truth of someone saying something about themselves, if you were wise, you can see what that person or truth or an argument is like. And then because the wisdom shines, illuminates that subject, that idea, that feeling, that object, and then it shines into yourself. And so the eye is the direct use of wisdom. And there are traditional metaphors about insight, illumination, seeing the truth. These are all correspondences that are based on the fact that the way our eyes see things in terms of the light from the sun is the same functional form as the way we understand things by means of wisdom that comes from the divine sun or the divine source. And then this is reflected back onto our understanding. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are processes involved in the light shining on earth and us seeing things that are similar in functional form, or the functions of things are similar. So if we come back in more detail about how this might work, we can look at plants. Sunlight is also received by plants, and I mentioned plants earlier. If we have a picture here about photosynthesis, we see the light shining down on the sunlight shining on the plant, and the plant absorbs water and minerals and carbon dioxide, and it produces oxygen, and it produces fruit, plant sugars. So this is a well-known process of plant operation. So the question is, how is that similar? Is there anything similar to anything spiritual in those processes? So I'm going to say that plants correspond to our first understanding, our first rationality. I'm going to explain in details in some detail, how that proceeds and why it makes sense. With plants, see, now I'm going to describe the plants first and then show the spiritual things in parallel. Plants use light in photosynthesis to produce oxygen. And our first rational awareness uses wisdom to produce that. Our understanding uses wisdom to produce a first general rational awareness. So oxygen goes into the atmosphere. The oxygen spreads around in the atmosphere, and that makes us live. So I'm saying that's similar. If there was a spiritual air, it would consist of the things, this first rational awareness that's produced. Now, if you read Swedenborg, he describes living in the spiritual world in which there is such a thing as air, and the kind of air is different in each place of the spiritual world. And that's because the air corresponds to the first general rational understanding that comes from the divine source of light or wisdom. So, but this oxygen in the air, or this general rational in the atmosphere, is rather general. If we are to use it, we have to breathe in this oxygen with our lungs. And in the spiritual world, we receive this rational awareness by coming in our individual rational understanding. So there are trees, there are general rational understanding which receives the light directly, but we need more than just light. We need food, we need air, and so on. So we're talking about what those things correspond to in the rational world. And so there are several stages in the way in which rational understanding or wisdom comes down to us. Swedenborg talks about the lungs corresponding to our understanding and the heart corresponding to love. So in us, there are things that correspond to understanding and love. And so we want to understand what the functional forms are for our lungs and for our heart, because these functional forms of our lungs and our heart and our physical body correspond in some ways, the same functional forms, A going to B going to C, is the same functional forms as a spiritual process. So on the left here, I have the physical process, and on the right, I have the spiritual process. So once oxygen, which is this first rational understanding, is taken into our lungs, it's spread around the body in the bloodstream. And spiritually, this corresponds to this rational understanding is carried around in us by something else, some other different kind of process. Well, I call it a mobile love, a love of doing things, a love of uses that distributes this rational understanding. Because rational understanding by itself isn't much use. Swedenborg also has the metaphor of rational understanding as like a coin or money. And those of you who know about coins and money will know that you can't live on money. Money is useful, but only because it's an initial stage of doing something else, which actually leads to living. But I'm not going to mention money again. But in the body, the oxygen that comes from the plants into the atmosphere, and then from the atmosphere into our lungs, and from our lungs into our bloodstream and carried around by the heart, is then combined with food to produce energy where it's needed in the different parts of the body. So rational awareness combines with stored loves to produce some individual intentions or desires or actions in the spiritual body. And overall, we say that the energy that started off from the sun, the light, and produces action. And that's the physical process. The light and the energy from the sun produce actions in animals who breathe in the oxygen that comes from the plants. And in the spiritual world, desire or the rationality is the means of the desire operating. If you have a desire and you want to do something good, you have to use rationality in order to do something good. And so therefore that produces action. So overall, we see that plants correspond to one particular aspect of spiritual activity. The aspect I'm talking about is when sort of pure wisdom from the sun is converted into something which is more useful for us in our bodies. And I've tried to explain that to us. But I'm talking about the ecology of plants as a whole on the world. We need both. The whole ecology has to make sense as a process, and there's a similar ecology of functional forms in the spiritual world. So that's about plants and rationality, or plants and wisdom. Now we look at the flip side of that, which is to do with love and energy. And I said love and energy are sometimes taken to be identical, but I say they correspond to each other because love is spiritual and energy is physical. But we'll see that they behave in similar functional forms, so it's easy to get them confused because they behave in the same way. We also receive energy from the sun. As well as light from the sun, we receive heat or energy. Swedenborg always refers to heat, but I think energy is a better way of thinking about this. And it's in the same way that we receive love from God. And the energy that comes from the sun warms the earth. It makes the earth suitable for growing plants, which we saw earlier. We need something like plants. If we had a rocky ground or a soil with no plants in it, that's barren, then it's not a fertile situation. So a rocky mind or a barren mind is to be distinguished from a fertile mind. So energy from the sun warms the earth, and love from God enlivens the creation. And so we talked earlier about the processes, the stages in which love comes through the spiritual world and into the mind and enlivens creation. The fact that God does enliven creation is the basic idea of theism. According to theism, the world is not created and run by itself. Rather, some basic shell is created, some framework which is then filled with love and understanding from God, which then operates as if it were operating on its own. And that has to happen all the time, continually. We saw back on that picture of a plant, it also produces fruit. So this first process of plants that convert the pure wisdom, the pure bright light of the sun, the clear light of divinity is converted into something we can actually use. This also produces fruit. And so I'm just going to say that we're going to call something a processed good, okay? Something that's processed that can be useful. So the fruit is something that we also get from plants, but it's not received by our lungs or by our eyes. Eyes receive the light directly, the lungs receive the light via the plants, but we also receive fruit that comes from this. And animals eat and digest this fruit, and that provides them energy for living. And this affections ingest. So the love that comes from God is used by our own desires and the framework of our life in order to enliven the life and do the things that we want to do. So we can always take in the love that comes from God and use it as we want to do things in our life. God seems to permit us to take things from him and use them as we want. This is a part of our freedom to do this. But furthermore, this fruit that we ingest comes into our mind, it comes into our mouth and then into our digestive system. So plants produce something that comes into our lungs, into our blood, but it also produces fruit which comes into our mouth, into our stomach, and is digested, and then goes into our bloodstream by two routes. So our blood ends up having two things that come from the sun. It has oxygen that comes from light, and it has fruit which come from plants, which also get it from light. And this blood has food, and it has blood cells which carry oxygen together, and it's moved around by means of the heart. So the heart is something that takes what we've received and takes it to where it's needed. So I say here that these are moved around the spiritual body by some inner love. So I'm thinking of the heart as some kind of inner love which wants everything to be used in a good way. So to some extent, I don't know the details of the loves that go on in the spiritual world, but by looking at what happens in the physical body, I can see that there are different kinds of motivations that must be present in a spiritual body if it's to have the same functional form. So I've showed the similarities between plant life and rationality, and then between energy from the sun and love. Now we come to the senses. Many of these are probably familiar to you. We talk about the senses perceive, and we talk about spiritual perceptions or spiritual sensations. Most people have some of each kind. And some people can't always distinguish them, but that doesn't mean that they're not two different kinds. And so some people actually, the spiritual perceptions overlay the overlay the physical perception. So they see things which are actually spiritual but are overlaid on the physical. But spiritual things don't have to have a configuration. We just see them and understand them. So the first physical sense is of eyes. We talked about eyes. Eyes receive light from a distance. Reflected light from the sun comes into our eyes. And so we think of spiritual eyes must be similar to that. We can imagine what spiritual eyes do. They receive wisdom that comes with only one or two steps from the sun into our spiritual body. There are not a lot of processes, intermediate processes. Maybe the light gets reflected around. If it's night, obviously, it's a bit different. Ears in the physical body detect variations in the air that are caused by the lungs of others, okay? In other words, people speaking. When I'm speaking to you, my lungs and my mouth are producing variations, vibrations in the air, and you receive them in your ears. Spiritual ears, what do? They must do something similar. They receive local variations in this atmosphere, this what I call the first rational atmosphere, and these variations must come from others. And from others, moreover, when they breathe out. So you can actually work out what breathing out means in the situation. It's feeding some air back into the atmosphere that's been modulated by one's own particular desires and intentions. A physical nose detects compounds in the air. It detects very small quantities of particular molecules that tell us whether things are good or bad, tasty or untasty. So a spiritual nose must detect something similar. It detects very small amounts very sensitively and I say good and evil, because it's not always easy to tell what's good and evil if you're looking at ideas that come onto you. But if you have a good nose for spiritual things, then you can detect what's good and what's not good. And so the spiritual nose does something rather similar to the physical nose. Taste. Physical taste determines the compounds being swallowed and digested. What does swallowing and digesting mean in the spiritual body? It means, okay, you can work out, if I talk about, can you swallow that idea? Can you digest that theory? There's a meaning to spiritual swallowing and spiritual digestion, which you can say. It's taking in ideas and trying to use them in one's life. If you swallow them and digest them, then you do use them in your life. If you swallow them and don't digest them, it means you initially consider it, but then you don't end up using it in your life. And if there's an idea which you can't even swallow, it means you reject it. You don't even accept it at all. So taste is part of the process of swallowing. It's determining what's good and not good, while in things being swallowed before they're digested. The fifth sense is touch. Physical touch detects other bodies that are very close. Okay, and you can work out what spiritual touch is when you're very close to other people. I mean, it's rather. I'm just saying that there's a similar function, so that there's a spiritual body which has all the same functions, A going to B going to C, but A and B and C are on one side physical, on the other side spiritual. And so it's possible. Swedenborg gives lots of examples. He has a training in medicine and anatomy before he became a theologian. And so he had lots of ways of writing about the body. He could write about the body at great length. And quite often you got the feeling that when he was writing about the body, he was expecting you to think of the corresponding spiritual activities. But in order to do that, you have to have an idea of what food is, what air is, what oxygen is. Swedenborg didn't know about oxygen. What light? We know what light and energy are. So I'm building up to the point that there is a physical body with the certain functions, and there's a spiritual body which has the similar kinds of function, but on a different level. And if we look at the human body as a whole, there are many. I'll go through the different functions, the different parts of the human body, and see roughly how they might correspond to spiritual activities. So the first thing to note about the human body is it's got a left-right symmetry, except for a few things. We've got 2 arms, 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 legs, etc. Only one of some things, livers and kidneys. But Swedenborg says that this symmetry corresponds to an equal reception of love and wisdom. You need both love, you need the light and the energy that come from the divine source. You need them in approximately equal quantities. And left and right are often used to refer to the particular aspects of love versus wisdom, or understanding versus desire, or energy versus form, activity. But these love and wisdom have to be combined, and so this left-right asymmetry seems to be a universal property in the animal kingdom. Actually, it's interesting to think about when it first occurred in the animal kingdom, but I think what I'm arguing is that the evolution of the animal kingdom, if it's going to receive life from God, must have developed this twofold symmetry, and so therefore there's, as well as natural selection, we can have what I call theistic selection, and things that survive better if they have this twofold symmetry, because this is the way they live better. If we start at the top of the body, we can have brains, okay? Well, I haven't mentioned brain so far, but the brain we think of as some kind of overall monitoring and management of the body. It doesn't actually give the energy for the body, but it gives the neural impulses which manage and coordinate the different parts of the body. So I see it as reception. Because there are many discrete degrees, a spiritual body at one stage has to receive from higher degrees, and so we think of the brain as the reception and stabilization of higher levels. It receives the high levels, and it also provides a platform for the high levels to exist in a permanent form. That's what I mean by stabilization. The lungs we've already mentioned. The spiritual lungs receive and modulate the local sort of rational atmosphere. And Swedenborg talked about how different parts of the spiritual world have different atmospheres, and people are happy in different parts according to their own rational understanding, their own life. The digestive system we've already mentioned. Senses is the reception and detection of forms. Heart is to do with the basic, one of the sort of inner powerhouses which circulate things to where they're needed around the body. Now, skeleton, you wonder think of all the bones in your body. What does your bones do? What would you be if you didn't have bones? You'll be a jellyfish, yes. And so I say here, bones, the skeletons are the general firm principles which keep your life in shape. In other words, you may be able to work out this yourself, but you've got to think of it in a certain way, that the skeletons are the very rigid things that have joints, so they move in certain ways, but they also have a lot of rigidity. They have an internal life to them. The marrow is very important, but the function of the bones as a whole is to keep your body in an upright form and functional form and do things. The nervous system, I mentioned earlier, spreads ideas. It doesn't spread energy around. It just spreads ideas or forms, controlling patterns. Now, the skin of our body is very interesting. What is the function of a skin? Can you imagine what it would be like without your skin? You don't have to if you don't want to. So the skin refers to the outermost levels. So it refers to the lower, to the later physical degrees that are the framework that stabilize the spiritual body. So the skin of the spiritual body corresponds to the physical level that keeps it firm and stable. And if you didn't have a skin, your body would fall apart, you'd leak, and you would disintegrate, you'd disperse. So skin is necessary. And then hair is beyond the skin. What does that correspond to? It corresponds to actual actions and power in the physical. And Samson's hair, of course, is a famous way of describing or using this correspondence between hair and physical power. And lastly, feet is what the whole body rests on. That also refers in some way to the physical world, because the spiritual world rests on the physical world, because actions in the physical world provide the standard functional form, the standard sort of containing form which supports the rest of it. But feet are not just containing, because you can move on your feet, okay? Feet move around. And so that I say that the outer levels which determine our spiritual place. And if you look in the Bible, feet are used as something which has to be clean and they've got to walk on the path, etc. All of these things refer to determining one's spiritual place. You can move your spiritual state by means of your spiritual feet. And so I've gone through a summary of different processes in the physical world and different processes in the spiritual world, and I've seen how they're related, that they're similar. Now, you could just say that's a coincidence, that you can always find similarities like this if you look hard enough. But these correspondences only make sense in the light of what I talked about in the previous talks, when we saw there was causal processes. So all of the physical functions that I've talked about this evening are caused by the similar spiritual processes. And the spiritual processes keep their form because the physical process is going along at the same time and select what future spiritual processes can act. So so the way to think about this is that if you imagine a glove surrounding a hand in a glove, the hand is the spiritual body and the glove is the physical body that keeps it into a form. And those people that talk about the physical degree being the vehicle for spiritual life have some idea of this as well. So let's carry on. I want to say that I've mentioned theistic science in the title. There's not a lot of science because scientists are not really into correspondences just yet. So these ideas, I say, are just the beginning of a more complete theistic science. And in order to make a scientific investigation, we need much more scientific details and predictions about the things that are of interest. Connections between the mind and the brain is a topic of great interest in science at the moment. Everyone's struggling to understand how the mental activities are related to the neural activities. They continually talk about neural correlates of consciousness, NCC, but they don't really know what the word correlation means there. At the moment, it just means they happen to occur at the same time. But if you had ideas about correspondences and causal, discrete degrees, then you might be able to do better. And related to this is what the neural networks in the brain are actually doing. Because we have lots of biologists and neurologists measure neural activity in the brain, and they see various patterns, but they don't know what it means. And then there's the question of whether our mind is distributed through our body, whether it's just in our brain. That's a question that we don't really know. Some theorists about mind-body interaction are now going to a theory they call externalism, in which the mind is spread out over the whole environment. So when I see a chair there, my mind is actually at the chair. Now that might have a grain of truth, but then if it's going to go from the brain to the chair, surely it's got to go through my body on the way. And so we have to understand about mind and the body. And because all the correspondences that I talked about were correspondences of spiritual things with bodily things, not just with the brain, we would expect spiritual things to be connected to the whole bodily activity. And then there's the question of how sensation and perception actually work. Because if you remember the causal processes that I talked about were generation coming down and selection going up. And so that actually makes it rather difficult to get sensation, because sensations are physical things causing mental ideas or spiritual ideas. Every time you're in a mental state and you see something physical, the physical must have caused something to happen in your mind. And so you have to imagine in a scientific way how that could be organized.